Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Union, and in this one there are numerous advances across the front line in favor of the Russians without a single Ukrainian advance. The Russians have managed to fully secure Yunakivka in the Sumy region. They've also managed to continue the advances within the city of Kopiansk in the northeastern section of the front line, with additional advances to the west of Leman towards the supply lines of the Ukrainians in that section of the front line, and additional advances to the south of Severk during their new localized offensive. The Russians continue their offensive operations north of Pocrosk, and their main push is coming through the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region and within the Neeper region for these 24 hours. Starting out in the northern section of the front line, the Russians have managed to gain full control over Yunakivka following months of fighting. The Russians have now secured the southern and eastern outskirts of the settlement. Gaining full control over it allows the Russians to start using it as their logistical hub for further offensive operations towards Sqkm to the southeast, Marina to the southwest, and along the highway in a southwestern direction. However, it is still situated at the front line, which means that its use is still limited until the Russians create a buffer zone around it by capturing the forest patches and settlements within the near vicinity in the southern, eastern, and western directions. In the Kopiansk section of the front line, the Russians have managed to continue advances in the northwestern parts. The Russians are here working on gaining control over the apartment complex area in the northern parts of the city. The Ukrainians still have control over the majority of them, with the Russians having a foothold in them. The Russians are now working on flanking the western parts of it through the western direction, cutting off the supplies to the Ukrainian forces operating north of that in the industrial area, and moving on to the apartment complex area from the eastern and western directions. Getting control over it will secure the Russian foothold in the northern parts of the city and strengthen the offensive operations as they continue down along the northern flank of the railway, which includes the industrial area, the train station, and the apartment complex area in these three separate directions. Gaining control over these three areas will give the Russians the advantage within the city. There is still the school area and the apartment complex area in the southern parts of it. However, the majority of the important holdings is in the northern flank of the railway. If Russia is able to gain control over it, they'll be able to gain control over the crossing into the eastern parts of Kopiansk as well, and to gain control over the majority of it, establishing a defensive line along the railway will allow the Russians to have control over the railway up towards Moskovka and allow them to launch offensive operations to the supply lines of the Ukrainians with the forest patch area as cover. The apartment complex area in southern parts of the city loses its importance, as the Russians would be able to cut off the supplies of the Ukrainians, isolate the remaining parts of the city, and secure their positions within both banks of the Sqkm river line. With the recent push by the Russians along the forest patch area southwest of Sqkm, it is likely that the Russians will look to push towards the eastern parts of Kopiansk again, this time from both the western parts and on the northern direction. The objective of the Russians is to gain full control over Kopiansk as well as Kopiansk-Vostlovye, which will cut off the remaining supplies going to the eastern positions of the Ukrainians here across the Sqkm river line, and secure the positions for the Russians in the northern section of it. It will gain control over Kopiansk and the eastern bank of the Sqkm river line, allowing them to concentrate their forces on the western bank with a wider area under their control and the Kopiansk as a logistical hub, as well as concentrating forces along the river line on the eastern bank towards Borova. Following Kopiansk, the Russians will look to gain control over Borova on the eastern bank and Sqkm on the western bank, which will allow for additional crossings for the Russian forces on the western bank, and an additional crossing point, which is Sqkm, which can act as a logistical hub for their forces. Moving down south to the Leman section of the front line, the Russians continue the offensive operations in the direction of Derilove and Dobryshevo as they continue their operations to gain control over the supply lines leading into Leman from the northwestern direction. The Russians have now reached the outskirts of Derilove and are closing in towards Dobryshevo. Getting control of both of these settlements will cut off all of the supply lines to Leman from the northwestern direction and open up the road for Russian forces to start storming the city from the northwestern direction. The recent advances by the Russians from the northern and northwestern directions strengthening the Russian positions in these directions, allowing them to develop offensive operations towards the city, gain control over Leman, and align the front line with the Seversk river line north of Sloviansk, will allow the Russians to significantly improve their positions to the north of Sloviansk and Seversk, covering the flanks and supply lines heading into these cities, and also to significantly strengthen their positions east of the Uska river line for full control over it, gain full control over the river lines both to the north, the Seversk river line, and to the east in the Uska river line, will allow the Russians to significantly develop the offensive operations for future offensive operations west of the Uska river line in the direction of Izium, Balaklia, Shevchenko, and the positions it lost during the Ukrainian Kharkiv offensive, or to develop offensive operations towards Sloviansk and Seversk from the northern direction. Based on the developments by the Russians, both in the direction of the Oreshna, Kopiansk, the Uska river line in general, and Leman, as well as the offensive operations they've launched in the northern parts of the Kharkiv region, it is clear that they will eventually be launching an offensive operation towards Izium in the future to improve their positions for the siege of the Sloviansk-Yunakivka line. When this will take place, we do not know. As for the southern flank of Seversk, the Russians managed to gain full control over Berezhne, gain control over the northern outskirts of it, while the energy substation here along the railway remains under Ukrainian control. The Russians are slowly developing offensive operations towards Svenivka, which is similar to Vimka, just on the outskirts of Seversk from the south. The Russians will be looking to gain control over the last remaining fortified positions and settlements here to the south of Seversk before storming the town itself from the southern direction, or simply cutting off the supplies going here in the southern direction, with control over the settlements in the direction of Seversk from the south, and secure the northern flank for Russian offensive operations through Yunakivka and onwards towards Nukoforivka. The objective would be to cut off the supply lines leading into Seversk from the southwestern direction. Advancing towards the settlements of Rai Oleksandrivka would allow them to cut off the final supply line through the Sloviansk-Kramatorsk direction. However, the close proximity to Sloviansk and Kramatorsk means that they're within the range of FPV drone operators, both in the defensive lines and within these cities, which means there will be heavy coverage of these drones, and it will complicate any offensive operations by the Russians in that direction. However, a push through the fields to gain control of the forest patches and move onwards towards Yunakivka through these fields would be further from Sloviansk and Kramatorsk. However, again, it will be within the range of drone operators within the defensive lines along the canal east of these cities. And they will have much less cover from these forest patches in the coming months once the fall season begins and the trees lose their leaves. To the north of Pocrosk, the Russians launched counterattacks within Yunakivka, looking to regain full control over the settlement along the defensive lines, and with the push in then Novoshakhove towards Ivanivka, the Russians are looking to gain control over Doroshnye as well. So positional fighting continues on the northern flank of Pokrovsk. As for the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk and into the Dnipropetrovsk region, there's been significant advances by the Russians. Russians managed to secure Seleny and Andrivka-Kletsove, as well as the areas along the eastern bank of the Vovcha river line. This was reported by a Russian source that has direct contact with Russian soldiers along the front line. According to them, the Russians first managed to gain control over Seleny and Andrivka-Kletsove, following which the Ukrainians launched a counterattack to regain control of them. The Russians withdrew to these fortified positions to the southeast of Andrivka-Kletsove and the prepared positions they have entrenched themselves within, as the Ukrainians were launching these counterattacks, consistently launching artillery, FPV drone strikes, and so on those forces before regaining control of them. They are calling the Ukrainian counterattack not a real counterattack, but rather one simply to plant these flags, as we've seen a lot between the Russian and Ukrainian forces, where they're looking to plant flags here and there. There are a lot of Ukrainian forces in different sectors of the front line where they're being able to be resupplied by drones, which makes it difficult for the Russians to find them. And they will not be surrendering because they'll always have supplies, so they can sit in a hole, in a foxhole, or in a forest patch area for weeks at a time without being detected, simply being resupplied by drones. The Russians are saying that they're doing the same thing, where they're able to infiltrate deeper and deeper behind Ukrainian lines, where they can be resupplied by drones. This means that areas such as north of Pocrosk were likely being resupplied by drones, not by vehicles, which allows them to go deeper and deeper during these offensive operations, and that is what allowed them to go these 10-15 kilometers deep into the Ukrainian lines, because they simply were able to pass through them and be resupplied by drones. Within the Dnipropetrovsk region, the Russians managed to gain control over both Vorone and Horoshe following days of fighting. The Russians managed to secure Sqkm and Novoselivka. Following those, the Russians continued offensive operations towards Vorone and Horoshe. And similar to what was previously said, the Russian forces were able to infiltrate deep within the Ukrainian lines before the capture of Sqkm and Novoselivka, reaching the outskirts of both Horoshe and Vorone before they captured neither Novoselivka or Sqkm. With the control over both these settlements, the secondary forces were able to arrive, supporting the initial forces that were operating within Vorone and Horoshe, which allowed them to quickly secure these settlements. Now the Russians have already reached within Sosnivka, and fighting continues within that settlement, as Russians looking to gain control over the southern bank of the Vovcha River line and to advance to gain control over the fortifications and the defensive line just south of these settlements. Russians continued offensive operations along the first and second lines of defense of the Ukrainians here within the Dnipropetrovsk and Zaporizhia regions. This is likely also how they are fighting within Filia, despite the Russian forces having to cross over several river lines to reach Filia due to the Ukrainians counterattacking and regaining some positions along Dashna. They're able to resupply them through the use of drones, allowing for just a few soldiers to continue fighting within these settlements, and no need for a high-risk mission where they launch several armored personnel carriers, tanks, and infantry fighting vehicles to reach the front line, when they can simply walk tens of kilometers to the front line, or have light vehicles such as electric scooters or bicycles, where they can get close and close to the front line without being detected by the Ukrainians through the FPV drones. Allowing them to resupply through their own drones, they're able to carry little weight and still have the necessary weapons once they arrive, as these drone supplies appear with the necessary equipment. They can even communicate by having paper slips, write them, and then put them on the drone. This can give them orders or requests for supplies. Therefore, I believe we are still at the beginning of the development of these drones. There's a lot more to be done with regards using these drones in combat. But that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you for watching and have a great day.